Okay, hi, this is Paul Sackett, Good News Broadcast. We have a very special show today. We have with us a great entrepreneur and businessman and a philanthropist, Mel Cohen. Hello, Mel. How are you?
Hi, Paul. I'm fine, thank you. And I made it to Brooklyn.
Okay.
I made it back to Brooklyn.
Made it back to Brooklyn.
Yeah.
So you were born in Brooklyn?
Well, actually, Manhattan, and I spent the first 13 years of my life in Brooklyn.
Okay.
I had the basis of a good education here.
Great. Fantastic. So then you've made it back here to our new green television studio.
Okay.
With recycled parts. Might possibly have been from your elementary school here in Brooklyn.
Oh, okay.
It's all good. Mel has a very interesting background. A company called Melrose.
No, that was sold. That was
you
the one I
started.
started out of college and
Right.
Built up a display business over the last 50 years. Sold it in 1999.
Okay, but that you did create, and that was a very
Melrose. That was a
successful-
combination of my name and my mother's.
Yeah, Melvin Rose was your
Yeah,
mom's
yeah,
name,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so tell us, what kind of business was that, and how you got that started? Because you're a very successful businessman, and give us a little insight on how do you start a business and make it work.
Well, when I came out of the service, thank God for the GI Bill of Rights, but I was able to afford college. My parents couldn't. And I went to the Wharton School, part of the University of Pennsylvania. And when I graduated, what drives you is being poor and hungry. And I started selling ideas for merchandising displays to some of the major companies that were in New York. Some of them are still here, some have left. Pepsi-Cola used to have corporate offices at 3 West 57th Street, I remember. Exxon, that was way back then called Esso, was in the Rockefeller building. A number of the liquor companies, Shenley Seagram's is still here. Colgate was here. Standard Brands, I think, is still in the city. But companies like that were always looking for ways to sell their product at the point of purchase. So I dream up ideas and sub out the manufacturing. And after a year, I was so disappointed in late deliveries by the subs that I started making our displays in a loft over in New Jersey, and it just kept growing from there.
Okay.
When I sold out our 5,000 square foot loft, we ended up selling a business that had over 250,000 square feet. And we sold it to a competitor. And as I told you a little earlier, I needed a reason to get out of bed in the morning. So I kept one of the buildings, and we make some of those products that I told you about.
Okay, so we're going to learn about some more of your current
Right.
products that you're involved with, many of which are very important for humanity. Let's first talk about the Handi-hut, is that
Handi-hut.
right? And how that evolved initially and where it's grown to.
Okay. Many years ago, the New York Times was one of our display customers, and they were beginning to lose sales in Metro New York. Well, Jimmy Dolan, who back then was their Metropolitan Circulation Manager, came over to Jersey to see me, and he thought it was because the newsstands had poor displays. So we ended up making, maybe a dozen and a half newsstands. The first one we put on the corner of Broadway and 43rd Street. But the Times soon learned that it wasn't the display of their newspaper, but people were beginning to, this is after the war, it's in the 50s, we veterans are getting more successful, so they're moving out to Long Island, Westchester, and New Jersey. And they were losing their audience. It wasn't that they had bad display of product in the city. So I dealt with a number of these people who were the newsstand operators. In order to get a permit to operate that newsstand, the first priority back then, Koch was the mayor back then. Bess Meyerson was his human resources person or whatever. And the first priority for a permit went to a World War II vet. Second priority, I think, was to a disabled person, and I forgot what the third was. And I discovered in talking to these people who had these disabilities, they were given an opportunity, and they did very well with it. So when I got back to Jersey, I mean, we weren't in the newsstand making business. It was just something I did really for the New York Times. They were a good customer. So I had the feeling, because I used to mentor back in Passaic a junior achievement program for young guys and young people in high school who felt they wanted to get into business, and I told them what the pitfalls were and how much sweat they would have to put into it. It just didn't come from heaven. And I thought that if we could get handicapped people in something that was simple that they could do, it would be a way of getting them into this thing that I like called entrepreneurship. So next to my office, back then we were in the old Botany Mills buildings in Passaic. I built 3 walls around the wall of my office and hired a young man and called up, I forgot what it's called. I think it was it's a kind of a welfare department they have down in Trenton. They sent over some disabled people, one eye, a disfigured hand, things of that sort. And I hired a young man to teach them how to make keys, monograms, things of that sort. And a big supermarket developer at the time had recently built a successful one out in Wayne, New Jersey called Willowbrook, was building a new one down in Woodbridge, New Jersey, the Woodbridge Mall. So I called Rouse up. I think their headquarters were in Baltimore. And they were nice enough to let me put a kiosk in the mall and put these handicapped people in it to sell these handy items. And I went crazy trying to come up with a name for it. And I wrote a series of them on a list. And I loved the name because it was a kiosk of Hut. And we spelt it Handi, taken out of handicap, and called it Handi-hut. And I didn't want people to know that these were handicapped people. I didn't want them to feel that they had a tin cup, that they were really business people. So I found it was somewhat successful, but it was difficult for me to be in the display manufacturing business that was growing and operate a little kiosk, 80 miles away. So I sold it to the guy who was the trainer, gave it to him pretty much. And but I told Al LaCosta was his name, I want to keep the name, you give it some other name. So he called it the Handy Nook, and I kept the corporate shield that we had called Handi-hut. And about that time, kiosks, newsstands were beginning to get popular. So we backed into making, would I say newsstands? I meant to say bus shelters. I misspoke. And we ended up making the specs up for New Jersey Transit, had a bid on our own specs, and won the bid. And we backed into making bus stop waiting shelters. And we make them all over the country. When I sold the display business, I kept this little division making the bus stop shelters and brought it over to this freestanding building next door, and that's where we made them. And I got a phone call one day from the administrator of a veterans hospital out in West Virginia, and he said, "Hey, can one of those bus stop shelters be used for a smoking shelter? We got a lot of smokers and we don't want them in the hospital." I said, "Nothing to it." And what looks like a bus shelter with certain modifications where we vent the roof so the smoke can go out, we made our first smoking shelter. And that has grown into a nationwide business. As a matter of fact, we just shipped 20 of them to Trinidad because we came out with a way of making the parts flat where 2 people with just a couple of hand tools can put it together in 2 hours. 2 men, wow. 2 hours, the whole thing. Permanent shelter.
Wow, wow.
We have some down in Florida that can withstand hurricanes, for example, and you wouldn't know. So we do that, and we took over a bankrupt door business, the door has a special niche in this huge universe of doors for the balconies of high-rise buildings. And we're making one now that's a takeoff on that door to withstand hurricanes, 140-mile-an-hour winds. And then another one of the companies we took over was a skylight company. And from residential skylights, we've ended up making these big skylights. We just put one in Columbia Law School up the road here. We a couple of years ago, we did the Westchester County Supreme Court building. They're all over the place, you know. So it just keeps growing somehow.
And
so,
you keep growing.
Well,
right? Is
I
that
don't
right?
know.
I mean, you're not a guy who is going to stop growing. You like to work.
The reason I did this, I think I mentioned this to you before, Paul, is when I sold the display business, my wife said, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, I've traveled enough in the world. And I said, I need a reason to get busy because, sweetheart, if I retire, you get twice as much husband and half as much pay. So I said, I'm going to try to keep this little bus shelter and smoking shelter thing going. And then while I was doing that, the door business came along and the skylight business, highly engineered products, and we're very competitive in it.
Well, the hurricane potential of having something that can help in that regard is very powerful.
Oh yeah,
thing,
absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
And I think also I will say that having a type of a shelter for those that do make their decision to smoke available without, in essence, affecting people around them.
Who don't like smoke in their place.
We had a
and they're very
situation last
happy
night.
to see that they have the right to smoke. Good. They should. We respect that right, but not in my face or space.
We had a situation last night that we were out at a restaurant opening, and there was a guy next to us. We were outside doing the taping as a lot of celebrity football players actually were coming in, and one gentleman really was a heavy toker, and he was blowing out smoke like it was a chimney, and it really is offensive if you don't want to smell smoke.
That's right.
And so, but it's not for me to say don't do it, and I have done it in the past in my life or whatever. Let them go and be somewhere that's comfortable,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
So it's a very good idea.
Sure.
Now, in addition to your business aspect of you, you're a philanthropic gentleman, right? And you like to do good things. One of the places I know is in my own neighborhood where I live is a place called Symphony Space.
Oh, absolutely.
And Symphony Space, is it still called Peter Norton or Norton Symphony Space?
Yeah. Peter, we, as you know, Isaiah Sheffer and a neighbor and good friend of his, Alan Miller, started Symphony Space 30 years ago as a kind of a nice way of bringing good music to the neighborhood. And it's a long, complicated story, but they ended up with the real estate. But we were desperate for money to renovate this old movie theater that had around down on the side, on the 95th Street side, the old Thalia movie house.
The Thalia, I remember.
Right.
I've seen many a movie there.
Okay. So we were able to, through a whole real estate thing, we were given the space that the old movie theater was in and the Thalia that is in effect our basement, but you come in from 95th Street. So we now have two theaters. The main house has about 800 seats, and the Thalia has about 175 seats. And Peter Norton came along when we were desperate for money to renovate it and make it clean, new, and modern. And he made a substantial donation, and in return for that and in gratitude for that, we call it the Peter Norton Symphony Space.
Okay. Is he the Peter Norton from Norton Utilities?
I'm not sure. I know Peter, I think, came from the West Coast, as I was told, and I think he was heavy. He might be. He might be.
Okay. I wondered about that. I've done many stories on Norton. I always say it was him. It is him up there.
Yeah.
I could be off and wrong
Yeah.
because I wanted to do a show with them, and we'll talk further about that and how But how did you get involved? You're making
Well,
you're making huts and you're making doors, and how did you get into the Upper West Side?
A very good
kind of
friend
thing?
of mine from way back,
Yeah, okay.
in 1952, his sister and my wife were very close as girlfriends. And you may have heard the name Frank Lautenberg.
Oh.
So Marion, his sister, right after Carol and I got married, used to come over to this little apartment that we lived in, and she said, "You ought to meet my brother. He's as mashugana as you are." And Frank came over. You know, I love the guy, full of piss and vinegar and full of ambition and whatever. And he used to pass a little office space in the old renovated Carroll Hotel in Patterson, and there was a guy pumping away over a calculator doing the payroll for the local shoemaker and barber shop because they couldn't do deductions for Social Security. And it was called automatic payroll back then. That little guy sitting at the machine was Henry Taub. And Frank liked what he saw, and he used to go out getting customers for Henry for free. And that company today is called ADP, Automatic Data
Oh, boy,
Part.
oh, boy.
They're huge.
Yeah, they're very
huge.
large.
A multi-billion-dollar company. And I remember I was going skiing with Frank. Frank got me into skiing.
Yeah, you're a skier,
Yeah,
also
well,
a marathon runner.
That was Frank. That was Frank's doing. And we were coming down from one of those ski areas off the thruway. I think it wasn't Bel Air. It was another one.
Hunter?
And Hunter wasn't up then. This was years ago. And Frank said that they're going public. They needed money because they had so many accounts, and you had to keep records, that they needed this new gadget that people are using called a computer. And it's kept in an air-conditioned room. Back in the old days, they were huge machines. They threw off a lot of heat and all of that. So they went public, and so I didn't have much money back then, so I bought 100 shares at $1 a share. I can tell you funny stories about that. You want to hear one of them?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's why I'm here. I'm here to hear funny stories.
When I had Melrose Displays, every Christmas, the salesman that we had, "Oh, I want to give this good customer a bottle of whiskey," or whatever. And I said, "Look, I hate that kind of stuff, but we're supposed to be a creative company. I think at Christmas time we should do something creative in the way of thanking these people." Back then, we used to just call on the guys who were the marketing and sales managers responsible for display development. And later on, we increased it to having them invite their wives. So at one of these early dinners, I think it was in the Essex Hotel on Central Park South, on the top floor, they had a restaurant. And at the last minute, after we invited everybody who we were going to invite, at the last minute, I got the idea that as a place setting, we get 3 shares of stock. By then, it had gone up to $3 a share. We get 3 shares of stock, and make that a place setting for all the guys we invited. And I think there must have been 100 of them, if I'm not mistaken. So I call up Harvey Taub, Henry Taub. This is his real name. Everyone knows him, calls him Harvey. And Harvey called the transfer agent, and it took them a week to transfer out about 1,000 shares into 3-share stock certificates. Okay. You're too young to know this, but back on 2nd Avenue
Well,
back then,
somebody finally said I'm too young to know something.
there used to be a soda shop called The Flick. And
The Flake?
The Flick, F-L-I-C-K.
Where is this?
And it was on 2nd Avenue.
Okay.
And the girls were dressed like the Playgirl bunnies,
The Flake.
right? So
Jeez, why do I miss all the good things?
Oh, I know you're too young.
Why wasn't I born
we
earlier?
We had fun back then too.
Oh, you always had fun. And it was good, clean fun.
So
It's a different way of life.
the owner let
Nice
us engage these girls to serve the cocktails before dinner at this place, and they came around serving the cocktails. It was great. The guys sat down, and we had 2 guests during dinner. One of them was a comedian. It wasn't Jackie Mason, but it was somebody like that early on. And the other one was Frank Lautenberg, who is now the vice president in charge of sales. And Frank talked about the company and, with the shares in front of the guys and the whole thing. When dinner's over, back then we were still friends with Cuba. Some of the guys at dinner had 4 sheets to the wind. They drank too much. So a couple of them rolled up their stock certificates when these girls came around with the Cuban cigars after dinner. They lit the stock certificates and lit the cigar with it and said, I may not be a millionaire, but I know how to live like one. But there were 2 guys I remember who were listening, and they went out and they bought a couple of hundred shares at $3 each. Cost them $50,000-$60,000. And I remember meeting one of them about 3 years later. So sold it for $60,000. I mean, people who got in early on that one made a lot of money. That was one of the fun things that we did. Another, we took over the top of the Pan Am building where they had a restaurant back then, and the helicopters used to fly off the building.
Right.
And we had the Melrose Displays trip around the world. You took the escalator up to the restaurant at the top, and you were given a Pan Am bag with $100,000 in it, play money. And when they got to the top, it said, welcome to Hawaii. And during the cocktail hour, we had those gambling things, those casino nights set up. And when dinner was over, the first stop was Monaco with the money at the gambling thing. And when dinner was served, some girls came around wearing the leis, bonging something, and we had an Hawaiian dinner. And then we had a raffle afterwards, where the guy, not a raffle, but an auction. And there were guys bidding a couple of $100,000 or $500,000 for 2 tickets to Fiddler on the Roof and stuff like that with the play money. And so that was a lot of fun. And then another Christmas party, the USS Lines was trying to really get the cruise business started. It's become very popular today. Wasn't so much back then. And we arranged that on one of their ships that was scheduled to come in on a Saturday, that we could bring these VPs from the Essos and the Seagrams and whatever in for dinner, and they would have a chance to get them to see what cruising on their ship was like. And we had a fantastic dinner on that ship.
So,
it was beautiful.
In essence, these are all ways to keep business going successfully, profitability-wise, as well as emotionally. In other words, you made ways that made people happy. I mean, there was some excitement to it all.
And also, Passaic to this day is one of those enterprise zone cities because when the war was over, all the big industry that supported Passaic, Forsman, Woolen, Botany Mills, Kierfot, some huge companies, the town just fell apart. So these people who came in from Puerto Rico and places like that, we were one of those industries that came in to supply jobs. And it's helped to keep the town together, not just Little Melrose, but all the other companies like us that came in.
Let's switch a little bit back to the symphony space. Let's switch back to The Power of Good. Okay, a movie that you were...
Nicky Winton, yeah.
Connected with. Well, tell us how that occurred and how that movie ended up being in symphony space. And what did the movie represent, actually? Because we love the word good, Power of Good.
Nicholas Winton, as I got to know him, as I told you earlier, he was just 99. He's the last living Schindler. And we all have our fingers crossed for his 100th birthday next year. But after 9/11 in 2001, my wife and I were scheduled for a trip to Europe at the end of September, and we went. But the planes had stopped flying for a while, and when they started up, we got on a plane, went to Berlin, and from Berlin we took a riverboat down to Prague. And we were tourists, And one of the places that a tour guide who had a van took us to was a concentration camp that Hitler had established in a little village outside of Prague called Theresienstadt. And this was right after he marched in. He said at Sudetenland, when Neville Chamberlain went to see him, "Peace in our time," everybody remembers that piece of history. But Hitler kept going, and he took over Czechoslovakia and rounded up every Jew he could find and sent them out to Theresienstadt. And Germany was getting a lot of flack for it. World War II hadn't started. This was in 1939, in the fall or winter of 1939. And so Hitler wanted to prove to the world that he wasn't doing anything to even though there was this thing called Kristallnacht, where every Jewish shop had its windows broken. So Hitler invited the International Red Cross to see how he's protecting these Jewish people and others in Theresienstadt that he felt were enemies of Germany. So the IRC came 10 or 11 in the morning, took a little tour, had lunch, and left, and wrote a report that these people are given a place to sleep and eat, and no harm is coming to them. That was just before they built 4 gas ovens at the back edge of this little town. Well, when we got there, it's now a tourist attraction. And I went through some of the buildings that these people lived in. And you saw drawings from these little kids, 9, 10, 11 years old. And I mean, you have to be there. I couldn't describe it. You just have to be there to have impact. And I was in tears by the time we left the place. And as we got back in the van, driving back to Prague, I started asking our driver. Her name is Martina Stolwova. She told me about a documentary that was done in Czechoslovakia about an Englishman who back in 1939 was ready to go skiing. He was a man of about 30 years old at the time. And he got a call from a friend of his who was in Prague right after the Nazi roundup, who called, and this man was a Quaker, and he called Nicholas Winton up and said, "Nicky, please come here and help me." He said, "Hitler's just taken these people and thrown them in a field. Nothing, no housing, no toilets, no food, nothing, and it's winter, and it's freezing here." So Nicholas canceled his ski trip, came to Prague, saw what was going on, and he turned to his friend and he said, "What about the children?" There was no accommodations or provisions made for these kids. So only 2 countries in the world, sad to say, the United States was not one of them at that time. There were only 2 countries in the world willing to take those kinds of refugees in. One was Sweden, and the other was Great Britain. But Great Britain was a slow-moving bureaucracy, and peace in our time, and all this stuff. And they said they would be willing to take these children in as refugees if Nicholas could find a home for them and have at least $200 in their pocket when they arrive. And he did a fantastic job of getting people in Scotland, Great Britain, and whatever to take these kids. But one family said, "Oh yeah, we just want a little girl, maybe 5 or 6. Somebody else would want a grown boy." So he had to take pictures and blah, blah, blah. Went back to Prague, showed the family who had a girl who was 5. He had the family that would take him in. And let's see, it was January, February, March, April. And no, so he must have started in February. And let's see, it was February, March, April, May, June, July. So it wasn't. So it started in March, in April. In 6 months through October, starting in April, May, June, July, and August. So starting in March, every month he would ship 125, 150 kids, put them on a train in Prague, send them across Germany to Holland, where they got on a boat, and got off in England. Then these families would pick these kids up. On September 1st, in 1939, he had assembled, he was getting better and better at this, and the families knew what the Nazis were doing. We didn't know that much back then. They were begging him. They were in mile-long lines around the block from the hotel where Nicholas was staying, to take their children. On September 1st, in 1939, he had assembled his largest group, 200 kids. They were all at the train station in Prague. I think they called it the Woodrow Wilson Station in Prague. It had something to do with the League of Nations or whatever. And just then, on September 1st, Hitler had bombed and marched into Poland. You know what hit the fan? The train was stopped. Nobody got on that train. I can tell you that after the war, not one of those 200 children or their families were ever heard from again. They ended up in places like Auschwitz. But Nicky had saved almost 700 children. Now he's back in England, and he's in the RAF. And remember, England's in the war from 1939. It's September of 39. We got in December of 41. So England was in the war 2 years before us. So Nicholas is busy in the war until it ended in, when? 45. And he completely forgot that he had done this. One day in 1990-something, 93, 94, something like that, his wife is up in the attic of their house in Maidenfield, in Maidenfield in England, where they live. And she's going through a trunk, and she sees these pictures of kids and lists with names and addresses in Czechoslovakia. And she comes downstairs and she says, "Nicky, what is this?" And Nicky tells her the story that I just told you. She said, "Nicky, why didn't you tell me?" And they were married many, many years. And he said, it never came up in conversation. He never told anybody about this. There was a man who many people may remember, who was a big publisher in London back in the 90s, named Robert Maxwell. He owned, I think, the London Times. He owned the Jerusalem Post. He owned a lot. And he ended up, we think, falling off his boat in the ocean, and he drowned. There's a whole story about that. But his wife, Elizabeth, was a good friend of Greta, Nicky Winton's wife. And Greta happened to mention this to Elizabeth Maxwell. And she said, "Oh, we got to do something about this." So she arranged, first of all, they looked through the list, and she verified that this is for real. And a number of those children were still living in England. Some were spread out in Europe. Some had gone to Canada. They all spread out. These people, 40 some odd, 50 years later, had no idea who saved their life and how they ended up in England. And when they went back to Prague to find their parents, there were no parents, right? Because they were rounded up and exterminated. So Elizabeth Maxwell arranged for a TV show, much like the old one we had on TV called This Is Your Life. Yeah. By some ruse, you're going to see this in that documentary that I'm going to play the documentary. Okay. If
I get it, I might even be playing it right now as we're speaking.
There's Nicky
try to do that.
Sitting in the front row, and they got him there on a ruse. And the host of the show, a woman, tells the story of this young Englishman and the nearly 700 children that he saved and how he did it. And he created a refugee agency because she had to prove to the Germans, that this was authentic. And I think Nicky could speak German because his parents came from Germany. That's a whole other story. So at any rate, he's sitting there, and this woman tells the story of Nicky and how he saved these kids and got them out of Prague. And she recreates this whole thing, and then she said, "And aren't we fortunate to have Mr. Winton with us today. And the camera turns on Nicky, and he looks up. He's now an old man in his 90s. And here's this older man, not the young Nicky Winton. And he looks up in surprise, and she says, and Mr. Winton, do you recognize the woman sitting to your left? And he looks over, and he says, no. I mean, how would he? And she said, that's Vera Giesing, one of the children on the last train that you put together. And with that, she throws her arms around him, breaks down in tears. Nicky breaks down in tears. And the woman on the right, the same story. Anybody else here who would... And about 100 of them stand up in the audience. So, you know, it's quite a story. Well, when I heard this and that a documentary was made in Czechoslovakia about this story by a producer, a young man named Maciej Minash, and it won some kind of Slovak TV award, it turned out that the driver of the van did all the research for some of the background stuff of trains and concentration camps and all of that. And she knew it intimately. She was in effect, one of the producers. So Martina had one copy, a VCR copy, in English of that film. That's called, the documentary is called The Power of Good. So she gave it to Carol and me, and we brought it back to the States. And Isaiah and the board let me buy every seat in Symphony Space, and they gave me a date for those seats. That was September 18th, 2002, exactly 1 year and 1 week after 9/11. And I brought Nicky over. We paid for his fare to bring him over on the Concorde and put him up in a hotel pretty close to where Symphony Space is, and we brought over some of his crew, the guy who was the producer and his partner and their wives and stuff, and they spent a week here. And so we did the documentary. I think it was a Wednesday, the 18th. But Nicky came here a little earlier that. We kept him here for a week. He had an opportunity to meet Bill Clinton while he was here. Carol and I took him on a boat around Manhattan. He was curious as hell about where the World Trade Center had been knocked down, and the boat passed by that spot. But all sorts of dignitaries came, and we were able to find 12 of the children who lived in and around the New York area. Oh. We had them on the stage, nice. And the ambassador from England and a lot of UN people and whatever came up there. When I show you the documentary, you'll see the goings on. But Symphony Space is that kind of good news play. You know, there's an unheralded program that we call the Curriculum Arts Program that a young woman runs through the public school system, bringing the arts to the kids in the school system. It's a fantastic program. They do another one for immigrants in this country called All Right, WRITE, where they write stories, many of them about their experiences here. If you heard some of those, they do that program a few times a year, and they come up on the stage and do their story. You would break down in tears. They're so heartwarming, you know. But it's amazing how much people who've come from hard knock places come here and appreciate it as bad as America is.
No doubt about it. It's a lot of people work very hard, go through a lot of trouble and toil and sweat, and That's so right. on and so forth, yeah. And they bounce back up. Well, it's also where we live is considered the land of opportunity.
And look, it's immigrants that made America great. From the Pilgrims on.
There's no doubt about it. And continues to.
Yeah.
And continues to. Yeah. So there's a lot of good news. Well, obviously, you've been proud and happy. I know you have a family as well. You're mentioning Carol. I guess that's your wife, I believe. And you have other children, right?
Right, yeah.
And they're doing well. And would like to meet with them, talk to them about some of the things, outreaches. They're doing something in the music world, I hear. And
yeah, that's right.
That's a good thing. And so it's a lot of good news. And so obviously there's ways to keep a business started, get it started, keep it going. There's ways to then not only think about yourself, to be philanthropic with Symphony Space like that, and in essence, then, as a result, share somebody's, in essence, hardship with the power of good. And you've got a lot going on, and continue to.
One of the things of many things that I learned at the Wharton School was, if you don't make a profit, it means it's not wanted. So no matter what you do in entrepreneurship, as I did with these handicapped people, they had to get into a business that made a profit. Some businesses make more, some make less, but for it to be worthwhile, it should make a profit if it has a commercial aspect to it. But many people, unfortunately, are so unfortunate that they do need a hand.
That's true.
And that's why some of these philanthropic organizations, I duffs me cap to them. They do some wonderful work.
Great work, great work. Well, we're always honored to get that opportunity. We've made shows in Symphony Space. We made peace shows. We made over there. I've been involved with movies that have been out of there in that facility. It's a great place, and a lot of good happens.
And we do a number of free admission programs because their purpose is to be engaged with the community. And it's a wonderful organization. It really is. Yeah.
All right, Mel. Thank you very much for coming over to your
for having me.
Your original upbringing location, and done a lot since then. Obviously, we're able to share that with everyone here, and let's meet again and see if maybe there's some things we can do with Symphony Space or some of the work that you're involved with to help promote it or to do more good for the world. So thank you. Once again.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for watching.
My pleasure.
It's a big honor for us. Thanks.
Okay.